I'm Negley Harte, and it's the 23rd of March 2001, and I'm here in Oxford talking to Dr Max Hartwell in his home. Max, when you first came to Oxford in the early 50s, you were already a professional economic historian in Australia. Why did you decide to come to Oxford?
Well, let's get two things straight. I came to Oxford first as a graduate student in 48 to 50. And then went back to a chair in new university in Sydney called University of New South Wales. Then was the University of Technology. To head of faculty on the MIT sort of example, whereby the students of technology, science and so on had to do a course in humanities and social sciences. Well, I was told humanities, but I added the social sciences. And so I devised the course and headed the faculty, a new faculty. And I was, on my own choice, Professor of Economic History, which I taught. In fact, the main course I taught was comparative industrialisation.
Right.
And concentrating on the Industrial Revolution, England's relation to Australia, but also bringing in Europe and indeed Japan. And that was, I enjoyed that. It was a challenge and a different sort of challenge. And I had a very good response, both from the other faculty, the technical faculty, who agreed with me if they didn't pass the humanities and social sciences exam, they didn't get to the next year, they had to pass them. It was considered as an essential part of their course. And the course was roughly first year general, particularly English and English literature and so forth, and perhaps some remedial English because some of them needed that as well. The second year was philosophy of science, really, taught by a very able chap called Jack Thornton, but concentrated on the problems of scientific explanation and things like this. And the third year, they had a choice between social sciences, psychology and economics in the first place. And it was a 4-year course when you spread it out a bit. So I did that for several years. Well, the reason I left was, I suppose, putting it simply, is I had a very serious disagreement with the Vice-Chancellor and resigned and was out of a job. Now, I'm not going to go into this because it's a very detailed story and it's well written up in Australia. I found out, having put up a select committee to elect a new lecturer in history, and we selected a chap called Russell Ward, who became afterwards quite well-known Australian historian, had already written one good book. And the Vice-Chancellor refused to appoint him on the grounds that he would be a communist. And I just said, you can't apply political tests. I said, especially on your own bat, I mean, it's not on. And I put my job on the line. Well, of course, as you might imagine, I lost. And I found myself...
So you came to Oxford as a refugee?
Not quite, I suppose that's why I'm putting it. Anyway, I applied for the readership in Oxford without any expectation of getting it. And I got it. Now, I think it was helped by the fact that I'd been in Oxford the year before presenting my doctoral thesis, because before it finished, I had to come back and present it. And saw a lot of John Hicks, who was on the select committee, and we got on very well. Harry Allen, who was later professor in East Anglia, and various other people, but anyway, I got the job. At the same time, I was offered a chair in Edinburgh, the Foundation Chair of Economic History in Edinburgh. But I decided that, well, I'd already committed myself to Oxford, so I came to Oxford, and that's it.
Am I right in thinking that you were appointed in succession to Asa Briggs?
I was indeed.
Did you get to know Asa Briggs?
I knew him very well, because he and Neville Ward Perkins were the two active economic historians when I first came to Oxford. I used to go to their seminars and so forth. So I remain, and still am, a friend of Asa's. Neville Ward Perkins, wrote that very splendid article on trade cycles in the 1940s, but he died of leukemia at quite a young age. Yes, so that's it. I came, and Nuffield offered me a Professorial Fellowship, and so I came to Oxford and stayed.
Because you like Nuffield in particular.
I like Nuffield in particular. Well, Oxford's a very seductive place.
Of course.
It's got, I mean, it's beautiful. The university is a sort of unique sort of institution. And what I liked about it was there was no one on top of me and no one underneath me. And so in a sense you're a free agent, and that's very important as far as I'm concerned, because although I've quite enjoyed being a dean of a large faculty, I mean I had 40 on the staff when I left, you're always looking after someone else's problems and, you know, and so forth and so on. And it was quite interesting to be a professor in a new university, you know, planning courses and everything like that. But, and various people in Australia said, you'll miss all this, you know. I was important there.
Yes.
I was unimportant in Oxford, but the transition from being important to unimportant never worried me a bit. I settled down to Oxford. I loved teaching, and particularly undergraduates, but also graduates. And of course, I had the great advantage of Nuffield more or less allowing me, not free choice because all students had to go before the whole college, of having very, very, very much able to persuade good students around the country to apply, and you know, a lot of them. I mean, my first student, for example, was Patrick O'Brien. I rang round, and I didn't know Jack Fisher then, and I rang up Jack Fisher, have you got any good students? He said, well, he said, we've got not a bad sort of a chap, he said, but he said he'd be good enough for Oxford. And then I said, well, what? And I said, send him up. I'll talk to him. He came up and I talked to Paddy for an hour. I said, you know, you've got a studentship in Nuffield if you want it, because I was damn certain then of his ability, which, of course, subsequent events has more than adequately proved. And that began a lifelong friendship too, because Paddy's one of my closest friends. But so I had come to Nuffield, and of course I had this string of very good students.
Yeah.
I mean, Eric Jones, for example, Nick von Tinselman, Gary Harte. Now, when I say my students, a lot of those I shared with Habakkuk. And I think we're probably a very good combination.
Now, if I can step back just a bit to when you first came to Oxford, of course, Habakkuk wasn't yet here.
He came when I was there.
He came in 1950, so when you first came. But am I right in thinking that your original supervisor was Miss Mann?
It was indeed.
Now,
you know that well because you published the Festrit.
I did, and I knew Miss Mann very well, and you
Yes.
kindly wrote in that. And I remember talking to you at the time of that. That's we're going back to the what are we going back to? The early 70s now when we published that. And I remember talking to you about her then. But of course, Miss Mann was the first assistant editor of the review
Right, she was
back
indeed.
in 1927.
She was
So
indeed.
she takes us right back to the origins of the society. Now, tell us about Miss Mann.
Well, we never talked about the review with her, but I had a great admiration for her. She was a dead loss as a supervisor. Not because she couldn't have done it if she wanted to, but the tradition those days in Oxford, to a large extent, was you, as it was in Sydney with my MA, you got a topic and you went away and worked on it. I used to see Miss Mann once, twice a term, usually for tea. And very
Tea, not a thimbleful of sherry.
No.
Cup
It was
of
tea. And she always asked, very often my wife came along with our little baby, our eldest child, and we'd talk about this, that and the other, and whether, as we were leaving, Miss Mann would say, and how is your thesis going, Mr. Hartwell? I'd say, very well, thanks, Miss Mann. Oh, she said, that's good, and that was about it. I don't think she ever read a word I wrote. But I had she was a formidable person.
She wasn't. She was far too discreet and too ladylike to engage very much in reminiscence.
Yes,
I remember asking her a little bit about Lipson, and of course she had a very difficult time
With Lipson,
being
yeah.
diplomatic between Lipson and Tawney in the early days of the review. But she used to say, "Oh, I don't remember," when you
Yes.
pressed her about things.
Well, she told me one marvellous anecdote. When she first came up to Oxford, of course, women were very much a minority, and there was still a very large contingent of the fellows resented the fact women here at all. And she said there was one professor of history, and I forgot, I don't remember who it was now, she said, whose lectures I wanted to go to because he was an excellent lecturer. But he wouldn't have women in the class. But what he would do, he'd have his rostrum moved down the hall a bit. He'd say, the university requires me to lecture to women. The university does not require me to look at women. If you want to hear my lectures, you will sit behind me. And I said, did you put up with that? She said, well, I wanted to hear his lectures. Well, of course, she was one of the people who established the status of women in this university. I mean, both as a formidable scholar and as head of a college, she was a real role model for women. No, she was very nice, and I was only too happy to contribute to that best trip.
Now, if you look at looking at the figures of membership of the society, there was this first period in the history of the society which lasted for 20 years, from 1926 to 1946,
Yes.
when the membership drifted slightly downwards, despite all Eileen Power's efforts. And they brought in the founding 500, and they couldn't deepen the market for 20 years at all, and the wartime was obviously a difficult time.
Yes.
But then in 1946, the membership turns up, and it's 30 years of onward and upward growth to the time of the Society's jubilee in 1976. Actually, the peak year is 77, the next year. But it's 30 years of growth. Now, that was the period, if I may say so, of your prime. Did you realise when you came to Britain to do economic history in 1948, or when you came back to Oxford later, that you were in the middle of a boom subject?
No, I realised it was a growth subject because don't forget I was trained as an economist, not as a historian. I mean, I majored in history at City University, but my degree was in economics. I never even did a course in economic history until I started lecturing on it, because I remember well the first lecture I gave at Sydney University in economic history. In the class were chaps who'd been in the army with me, and they were giggling and laughing. And I said to them, "Is this the first lecture in economic history you ever heard?" And they said, "Yes." I said, "Well, rest assured, it's the first one I've ever heard too." So anyway, they were excellent, because after the lecture they come and say, "Oh, God, Hartwell, don't mumble, say it directly." You know, they were quite a good corrective influence in presentation, both in just how you spoke, but also in content. No, I realised that economic history was growing, and I think it was largely to do with the great interest after the war in economic growth. I think that the growth of economic and social history, I think, goes more to the economists than it does to any individuals in history or economic history, although they were important. I mean, people like Tawney was important, and T.S. Ashton. But it was the realisation that it was the Kuznets-like information, that the world consisted of, developed and undeveloped, as they like to be called, or underdeveloped. And the big question in public policy was how to grow, and the big question in economic history is why did we grow in the past? And I think that was a big incentive. But I mean, you were aware that, for example, the growth of jobs in economic history escalated in this country. I believe there were 30 chairs at one stage, wasn't there?
Almost,
yes. And see,
yes. Most of them, of course, have now gone.
Right. Well, see, the only senior people when there was chair in Cambridge, Oxford, Court in Birmingham, and I think Leeds.
And LSE, of course.
And LSE.
Well,
and
Court was the first.
There was 3 or 4 readers, and that's all. I was a reader.
Court was the first chair in the provinces, so to speak, outside what I call the quadrilateral, which was Oxford, Cambridge, LSE, but Manchester.
Manchester, that's right.
And there was a gap because Redford was reader for a time.
Yes.
But after the war, they make him a professor.
Right. And Unwin was at Manchester.
But Unwin died young.
Yes, he was. But he's one of them.
And at LSE, of course, there were 2, and then actually 3 professors, because there was Ashton, Tawney, and then Carus Wilson.
Carus Wilson, yes, Carus Wilson was.
You must have, you mentioned Ashton and Tawney already, you must have got to know, soon after you came back to Oxford, you must have got to know them, perhaps through the Economic History Society.
Yeah, it was that way, because although I was invited to give lectures here and there, it was through the Economic History Society that I got to know them. I mean, Ashton I have the greatest admiration for. I think that he and Clapham are probably the 2 outstanding economic historians in England of the last century, now it's the last century. Tawney, one can admire in all sorts of ways. I mean, he had genuine moral stature. I think anyone who's read his famous essay is called The Attack, is it, where he's experienced World War I, and also in other respects. And of course, that sort of moral stature he had, which was put him aside. I remember, I think it was the second meeting of the Economic History Council when I was editor to go, or assistant editor to go along and report. And one of the things I did, of course, was the finance. The editors did everything, then we'll come to that in a minute. And I could see we're running into the red, and I proposed to the council that we put up the subscription. And Tawney bristled and said, "What was our income last year, Dr Hartwell?" I said, "So, what was our expenditure, sir?" He said, "I see we made a profit." He said, "Your suggestion is immoral." That was the end of that. Next year we went into the red, of course. We had to put up the subscription. But that was typical of Tawney. He saw the world, I think, in terms of morality. And it was always entertaining. I don't know whether those early meetings that...
He's before my time. I didn't know
well,
him.
now, one of the things, meetings with him, he used to smoke a big pipe. And he got the idea that somehow, I think tobacco, I suppose, too expensive. He used to smoke, I'm told, it was seaweed. And he'd sit up in front of the society and he'd stuff his pipe with this. And that stage, the poor talker, lecturer, everyone watching Tawney. And he'd strike his match and then everyone, because when he put his match, the thing used to flare, you know, sparks going in all directions. But he had a marvellous capacity.
And it didn't go out at all, you said, because he used to put his pipe in his pocket and set fire to his jacket.
Very often, yes. Mrs. Ashton told me about that. He'd sit there as the president, and the people would go fast asleep. He'd wake up expertly at the time the paper was finished, and always ask relevant questions. Now, I don't know whether it was osmosis or something that the knowledge drifted into his mind, but no, he was a remarkable figure. You had to admire him, and he was quite good fun too. But well, I mean, I didn't agree with a lot of his points of view. But
he couldn't. One thing he couldn't do, as the first of your stories reveal, was that of course he couldn't count.
No.
And now I expect that you might have thought that was a bit of an obstacle as an economic historian.
Well, I remember John. What's his name? John Cooper, you know.
Oh yes.
Who wrote that
Counting Amounts
article, which is exactly on that. That's right. I mean, Cooper showed that, you know, simple arithmetic would, and of course I believe that's all you need in economic history, quite frankly, simple arithmetic. Good luck to the people who can do more sophisticated techniques, but they're not for me. But yes, he couldn't count, and I think he had he had a curious idea of extravagance and things like this, I think, and he didn't. The world had...
Dirty old clothes.
Yes, and I think the world had grown in such a way that he probably didn't, well, he almost certainly didn't approve it. He said to me once, for example, we were standing and the cars were buzzing past, and he said, "I suppose mankind deserves the car." Well, I thought he meant it in a positive sense. He meant it in a negative sense. And I only realised that when I got the inflection of his voice. And that was the attitude, you know, we shouldn't, you know, it's a terrible thing.
Did you know Mrs. Tawney, Jeanette Tawney at all?
Never met her even. Never met her. I met Mrs. Ashton often enough.
Well, Tawney was, of course, president of the society from 46 right up to 1960.
That's right.
All through the 50s. And then he was succeeded, then they decided to make the presidency last for just 3 years.
That's right.
And he was succeeded, of course, by Ashton.
Yes.
But Ashton, you must have found a more attractive figure.
Not more attractive. Ashton was, well, he was a little man for a start, as you probably know. But, and he, well, I think he's almost invariably correct about what he said about everything. I thought he was absolutely marvellous about the review and also what he wrote. I mean, I think there's nothing he wrote which wasn't not only extremely well written, he's a beautiful stylist, but as far as I'm concerned, he's by far the best economic historian of Britain. I mean, I don't think there's anything of his that can be corrected, really, changed a bit and so forth. And of course, and some of his reactions I saw were almost emotional. He said to me once on the standard living question, he said, "I can't believe that about those people in Manchester." He said, "They wouldn't be that cruel, or they wouldn't be that difficult and so forth." He just felt that, of course, he was Manchester through and through. And of course, that's where he got his liberal economics from. I mean, he believed that, you know, in free trade and the market and so forth. But he was gentle, he was nice, most cooperative, and I never had a crossword. I didn't have a crossword with any of them actually, but I mean, Ashton I particularly revered. And He said to me once something which endeared to me when that book of mine, The Industrial Revolution, came out, and he wrote to me, he said, I really admire your style. And I thought, oh, coming from Ashton, that pleased me more than anything about the content. he was an extremely nice and gentle man. And then I think who succeeded him, Habakkuk or Boston, I've forgotten now.
It was Boston,
Yes.
63 to 66,
Right.
and then Carus Wilson,
Right.
and then for a time Court, and then they brought in Sayers as an economist.
Yes, I've forgotten that.
But sticking with Ashton and Tawney for a moment, they of course got on strangely well with each other. It was after all Tawney who brought Ashton to LSE from Manchester, and you might have thought that they were at opposite ends of an ideological and very different in background, but they got on with each other very well.
They admired each other enormously, they had great respect for each other, and the triumphant, you might add to that in a sense, although they didn't know Tawney so well, was John Hicks. John Hicks lived in the same village as Ashton in the Cotswolds, and was a great admirer of Ashton. Ashton was a great admirer of Hicks. Mrs. Ashton, I'm told, and she told me, it hinted to me, that dreaded a visit by Tawney, not because of Tawney, but because of his damn pipe. She said, finally got an old carpet which we put in the corner, we made him sit on a chair and that, so that our carpet wouldn't be ruined by this flying debris from his pipe. But I don't know how much that went on. No, they were very, got on extremely well. Well, see, they were both.
We're putting on more lights, Max. Is that's
Yes,
is that
fine.
is,
You want
is
me
even
to-
more lights?
Is that enough? Well, put
where do we
that's
get the
over
light?
here, I think, that one. No, maybe the last. Did you put the two on there? Not that one, no. The two that way, yes. No, the other way. Is that one on? No.
Ah, yes. That's better.
Well, come over here.
Yes.
Come
Put
over here.
them on, Georgia. Leave them on.
Put that one on there. No, these damn things don't come on for some reason or other.
I think well, that seems to be fine.
Is that enough?
Yeah,
Okay.
I'm sure that's okay. Sorry, we interrupted you. We were still
That's
talking
all right.
Ashton.
No, I think that there was just of course, generation they were more together.
Oh.
I mean, they both were before World War One,
Yes.
and Ashton had that fearful and supreme experience of fighting in the trenches and so forth, which was not Ashton. Tawney did. Ashton never had that. But there was obviously a close bond of friendship, and also appreciation and admiration for each other.
When you came back to Oxford, the other readership must, I suppose, have been held by W.G. Hoskins. Did you have much to do with him?
No, and he wasn't here for long. He went off, and I suppose he was succeeded by Joan Close.
He was, yes.
No, I never met him a few times. I was never particularly friendly with him, or even Joan. I knew her well enough because we're here. But see, Oxford does separate people into colleges.
Yeah.
We meet on faculty, and examining, I examined with her. But I didn't know her particularly well.
But your closest colleague in Oxford was in fact Habakkuk.
Yes,
Because
by far.
he says you used to teach, a lot of teaching together.
That's exactly it. I mean, the thing is that the Oxford system of supervision, for example, was that, and when a student is accepted for a postgraduate student, they appoint a university supervisor, right? They're supposed to supervise research. And I belong to the generation where we changed the rules and made that real supervision, not just nominal.
Right.
And my college, Nuffield, was very paternalistic, and they always appointed an internal supervisor. Now, I thought it was an excellent idea if I could get Habakkuk as the university supervisor, because he was so good, and myself as the internal supervisor, and between the two, and see people like Paddy O'Brien or Gareth Stedman Jones, or the chap who's head of wrote the book on statistics, and so I went to Cambridge,
Roderick Flood.
Roderick Flood, were jointly supervised by us. And I think we were, Charles Elliott was another one, I think that we were a good combination because we had different gifts. Habakkuk used to scare them sometimes because he's very austere in his expectations of what you should do and so on. which I was too, but not in, somehow or other I didn't seem to scare them, whereas scare is too strong a word, but he engendered enormous respect for his ability, and I thought he was an excellent supervisor. And he ran seminars, which I always attended, of course, and they were good seminars. No, I think that we were quite an effective team.
And of course you became a team, especially in connection with the Economic History Review, because you became assistant editor of that in 1957.
Right.
And then you succeeded Rothgar Habakkuk as editor in 1960.
Right.
And for most of the 60s, you were a very active editor, first with Charles Wilson. I'll ask you about Charles Wilson in a minute, but you really took over from Habakkuk.
Yes, well, Rothgar and I worked extremely well together. Now, don't forget those days, the editors did everything, including the proofreading.
Yes.
I used to sit with Rothgar at a table reading the proofs. You know, there was no, of course, Xeroxing of articles those days. An article came in, you considered it, he considered it, or we both considered it. And we rarely, and I was the same even when I became editor, really got external advice. It wasn't the habit of either me as editor or Rothgar or Charles Wilson to seek external advice. Now, of course, we had a very, very good assistant editor in George Holmes, first-rate medievalist, later professor of medieval history. And between the three of us, we reckoned we covered the subject. But with Rothgar, it seemed mainly getting through the work, getting a volume together, getting to, but that was partly solved by my going to the college, and the college, in effect, granting me secretarial assistance to run the review.
Right.
So the secretarial, if you like, the headquarters of the review gradually gravitated to Nuffield, especially after Rothgar.
And you were lucky enough to find Miss Brotherhood,
Miss Brotherhood, who
Miss
was
Brotherhood,
superb.
who became quite a figure in the subject for a
and
time.
she did one of the indexes. She did
She
one
did
with
the first
me.
index.
Second one came along, and I said, "Why do you do that?" And
Yeah.
then she wanted.
So you were still running the review, really in the way that Poston had in the previous period.
Well, I don't know.
I
about
suppose.
that.
Well, Rothgar took over from him.
Yes.
Did you have much dealings with Poston?
No. Well, only as his contributor. I found him. He was one of the people who was, when I was invited to take over. I think it was Poston and Tawney who actually. Yes, I think they were the two people who got me and said, you've got to do this and so forth. Now, when I was asked to be editor, I said yes, but on one condition, that I get a co-editor who will help. I said, I don't want to do it by myself. And I think it was Poston's idea to get Charles Wilson, I think. And Charles and I hit it off immediately.
You did.
He was superb, and we worked in a very informal fashion, over the phone a lot of it, and we'd get an article in, and I'd say, Charles, you better read this one, and he, and so forth. And there were no formal meetings, and it just worked. I mean, it was just congenial. He was very efficient when occasionally we both lapsed, but he was very efficient, but such a congenial man to work with, and also, a really good historian. I still think England's Apprenticeship was one of the best books of economic history written in his generation. I don't think there's anything better. It's really a superb piece of work. And so that worked very well. And George Holmes is a personal friend too, and George was excellent. I mean, again, very calm, very helpful, and so forth. It was sometime, I think, towards the end of that period that we began to get some editorial help. The society gradually began to realise it was too much work for the editors and they should get professional. I've forgotten the dates, but you'll probably find that. But no, it was a...
well, this was a period of great growth in the subject.
Yes,
so you must have been having, the pipeline must have been expanding because you must have been getting more and more articles coming in every day.
Well, we're getting about 3 a week, if I remember rightly, for a lot of that period, at least 150 a year. And we accepted about 1 in 3, I think it was. I don't know.
Was it?
Yes,
Yeah.
I've forgotten now.
Yeah.
Anyway, yes, you were never free from reading articles. Charles and I had a rule that every article was published should be read by both of us.
Right.
It was medieval. George also had to read it. Charles and I met made our mind up. Obviously, that and the other.
Yeah.
And we gave editorial assistance, but I learned very quickly when you turned down an article, you didn't tell him why, because otherwise you started a whole correspondence. And so I devised a formula like something. The editors of the review have read your article, graded but feel it is not satisfactory for publication. They can always review yours truly, or yours faithfully. And that usually stopped them in their tracks. It was pretty rude, but it didn't. I mean, there's enough work to do without any. And then occasionally, of course, we disagree about articles. But occasionally, most of the time, we didn't. It was an easy going. I disagree with Donald more often on articles. And we had a rule too, that Charles and I, that if an article came in was written by a student of his or a student of mine, the person whose student it was had nothing to do with the publication. He stood aside, and the decision was with the other editor. He'd get what help he liked. And sometimes, Charles, what the hell do you mean by turning it down? I said, well, but again, Charles would never. He just said, yeah, well, that's fine. That's our rules. Now, Donald didn't agree with that. Donald Coleman was, he was, if I turned down an article, he really got upset. Or an article of one of his students and so forth. But
did you choose Donald to succeed Charles?
No.
As joint editor?
No.
Or he was chosen by the council in
by
the
the council,
president?
or, the seniors of the council. No, I didn't.
Yeah.
I
And
mean,
you didn't get on with Donald?
Yes, I got on very well with him. He just had a different style. For example, we'd have a meeting with Charles and I. We'd have a meeting, and that'd be it. Yeah. And I'd say, Charles, you do this. He'd say, do that. Donald, after a meeting the next day, I'd have a type letter from him saying, at our meeting yesterday, we decided A, B, C, D, and E. Well, I mean, that was much more businesslike in a way, but it didn't suit my temperament, and it wasn't what I'd been doing. But no, Charlie, he was very efficient, of course, very able and very industrious and everything. No, he was a good editor. It just wasn't my style. And in any case, by that time I'd done a lot. And there's no doubt that being editor occupied more than half my time a lot of those years. It was really quite a big job. I mean, for example, you had a rigid timetable. Such a date, copy had to be ready. Such a date it had to go to the printer. And then, mapped out over a year, and you had it. It was like Mrs. Brother, I think, had a chart beside him. And she'd ring up and say, have you got the copy ready? And I'd say, no. She said, well, you're supposed to go to the printer tomorrow. And so, but she was very efficient. But no, it was, put it this way, Charles and I had a very good informal working relationship, which demanded the minimum of any sort of paperwork, bureaucracy, and we had an excellent secretary in this brotherhood. It went on. Well, Donald was, again, I only had one row with him, not row, it wasn't a row. I turned down an article, he got very upset about it. And he wanted to revise that first article of Gary Hawke's, which has become a sort of classic on railways in Britain. And came back and more or less refused with possibility of revision. And Gary was upset, and I said, Gary, don't worry about it. These are the days before. I said, go to the penultimate paragraph and change the verb in one sentence. He did, and I said, now write to Donald and say, I'm very grateful for your advice, Professor Coleman, and I think you'll probably approve, or I think you'll accept this article in its revised form, which he did.
Well, Donald did like to revise things. He put a lot of effort into improving things. He was, of course, my supervisor, so I remember it well.
I know I've no complaints about him at all. No. I mean, I worked very harmoniously with him, but it was a
he could get bees in his bonnet, where yes, he could get
different style, and I wouldn't survive 2 days in editorship these days. But those were different days. Very, very much more informed in every respect.
But days of boom. Now,
yes,
after the...
Yes. Let me tell you an anecdote about... No, we'll forget that one.
You, at one stage, I think on the telephone, you promised me an anecdote about Poston.
Yes, well, that's a good one, actually. Poston, we had a rule, and I don't know whether it was put in, not a rule, a sort of an attempt to give a structure to each issue of the journal. There should be a medieval, a middle period and a later period. In other words, we should try to have a range of articles over the same things. We always had difficulty in filling the medieval, and probably today, well today you don't even try it, I think, but Poston said, I'll have an article for the next issue. Right. So anyway, it was late, but we met, and I said, oh, you know, Mooney, you must have that article because we go, in a couple of weeks' time, go to press. And he said, oh yes, that's right, pull it. He said, here it is. And I, oh, that's right. He said, but the statistical appendix is not there. I said, what do you mean? He said, well, he said, I don't know, there's a lot of figures and I couldn't put them together and they didn't add up. And so I've got the help of the Institute of Statistics, whoever is in Cambridge, to sort them out for me. I said, well, does the article need this? He said, the argument depends on them entirely. Anyway.
But he found it easier to get an argument than to get statistics.
A fortnight later, the statistics came in, and it was about 10 years later that somebody did point out that an article followed that they were incorrect, or in certain ways incorrect. But he was great fun. Yes, he was really great fun. I used to be terrified not driving with him because he'd drive and then he'd start a conversation. He'd be going like this and he'd be talking over his shoulder like that. Yeah. But no, he was again, well, a remarkable person. I mean, you talk about intuition. I mean, very often I think his interpretation came from intuition and not from evidence, but he was usually very often, or mostly I think he was right. I mean, that excellent article of his on the, on capital of the early 18th century, where he points out, which everyone should have known but never made explicit, of course there's enough capital to launch an industrial revolution or two or three.
In medieval times.
In medieval times, exactly.
Yeah.
But he was a great character. But anyway, that more or less finishes my editorship, doesn't it?
Well, I want to ask you about conferences, which takes us back a little bit, because the first residential conference was held at Birmingham in 1950. And neither Joan Thirst nor Oscar Habakkuk can remember it.
Neither can I.
You were perhaps you've gone back to Australia.
I went back in 50.
Did you? Now, and from 46 to 47, 48, 49, they had day conferences at LSE, an expanded version. Did you go to those?
No, I didn't.
And then the second residential conference, which lots of people remember, was in Oxford in 51, but you were back in Sydney.
Australia. Now, when I came
what
back,
is your memory of conferences when you came back in the 50s?
Well, when I came back, I think I went to every conference, partly because I was, acting in the editorial capacity and therefore I had to report to council and so forth. I always enjoyed them thoroughly. They were great fun. There were a lot of very, very good economic historians. I mean, rather different mould than today's, but you got round the country in a way, because to me that was, I'm a foreigner, don't forget. So I got to places I might not have otherwise seen. And secondly, they were very well organised. And usually finished up with a nice dinner with all the people there and so forth. And they're always great characters. I mean, Jack Fisher was always there, and if you want to have a good evening, you just heard Jack perform. He disliked Oxford intensely, or he pretended to dislike Oxford intensely. So anyone from Oxford there always goes to the end. He was part of his teasing on others.
He liked to have a butt.
Oh yes, that's right. And I was that often when it came. But there were lots of other people. I mean, people I had utmost respect for. People like, one of my favourites was David Chambers. And I think he was a remarkably good historian also, incidentally, a very good economic historian. And of course, he was interesting. I mean, I didn't realise till I got to know him, because his sister was one of D.H. Lawrence's paramours, or at least supposed paramours, alleged paramours.
Yes.
But he was an interesting man. Of course, he was responsible for the initial training of one of the best students I've ever had, Eric Jones. Yes. Eric, I think, is the most imaginative student I've ever had. I can't remember anyone who's managed to, well, to an important extent he's made long-term economic history respectable, although most economic historians wouldn't say so, I would. And I think it's also right to tackle these long-term problems. which he has done very successfully in my view. But David Chambers, Court, Beresford, Keris Wilson, you know, interesting lot.
They were great figures.
Yeah.
I remember meeting David Chambers on one occasion, and he said, I'm just about to go to Australia to give a lecture. And so I was quite young and innocent, and I said, what's the lecture on? And he said he can't remember if it was on D.H. Lawrence or the Industrial Revolution. But he said, they'll remind me when I get there.
Yes. I went and gave a lecture there. I've forgotten Nottingham sometime, but I lectured then as now. I mean, you have the visiting firemen all the time. I mean, they'd have most departments would have a series of lecturers in a term. They'd always have 2 or 3 foreigners. I mean, 2 or 3 visitors, and in that way, I got to see a lot of places, and a lot of.
I remember the first time I met you, you came to talk at the Tawny Society at LSE, of which I was the secretary.
That's right.
And you arrived one of the first speakers that we invited. I would think it would have been 1965.
I remember going there.
And you came bounding up the stairs at the LSE, and we said, we were treating you with enormous respect, of course, and we said, we've got to come this way and have a cup of tea. And you said, the first thing I've got to do is have a pee. I remember that.
I still have that position. Now it's been aided by several operations. Yes, well, that was a reasonable request.
I remember you too having a big set-piece debate with Eric Hobsbawm about the standard of living debate at the Birmingham conference in 1970, presided over by, you mentioned Court already, but presided over by the rather austere, it seemed to be, figure of W.H.B. Court,
yes,
taking the chair. Yes. With some trepidation, because he thought that you and Eric might have been, but of course you were always on perfectly good terms, weren't you?
Perfectly good terms. I mean, I don't admire his history very much, but except of course he's an enormously able, prolific, etc., etc., etc. But any man who could believe in the Soviet system, and any man who could keep it up for so long, and any man who believed in the Marx interpretation of history, to me is just something I can't understand. I mean, irrationality in any mind I find difficult to comprehend. But then maybe I'm the one who's crazy, not them. No, Eric was incidentally on that sort of controversy about 3 or 4 years ago. It mightn't be that long. One of Charles Feinstein's lectures, seminars. There was a paper given by a young man. I think he was from Brooks. It was quite a good paper. It was on social history, adolescence, I think, if I remember rightly. And after he'd given it the discussion, he raced up to me and he said, "Oh, Dr. Hartwell," he said, "I'm so glad to meet you. I've always wanted to meet you." He said, "You know, I was taught economic history in those great days of the 60s, when economic history was so exciting." He said, "With you versus Hobsbawm, you versus Thompson, and so on." He said, "Well," he said, "it was really exciting. We loved it." He looked at me and he said, "Of course, we hated you." He said with a wry grin, which I assume was a wry grin. But yes, it was exciting in a way. Well, of course, there's been two great controversies in English economic history in my lifetime. One, of course, the 17th century, and the other is the Industrial Revolution.
The gentry, and yes.
I mean, and I think it's a good thing for the subject. I mean, there's no doubt that. I mean, I made myself almost famous by opposing Eric Hobsbawm.
But you were right, of course.
Of course I was right. I knew that straight away. Now, don't forget, see, I was brought up, I'm a colonial, don't forget. And all my initial training in economics and in history was in Australia. And my first writings were in Australia. I mean, just got out the other day to get a quotation on my first book was an economic history of Van Diemen's Land, and which was my MA thesis, really. But see, I was brought up, when I went to, I was an evening student at Sydney University getting my first degree, and I went into the honours seminar in history, and the texts were 2 books by Brian Fitzpatrick, The British Empire in Australia and British Imperialism in Australia. And of course, I just couldn't swallow this. The idea that Australia was an exploited colony was so counterintuitive that it was almost funny. And these were taken very seriously. And it was just so counterintuitive. And those are the days when, you know, we're belting England at tennis and practically anything else you like to mention, but it was the days Don Bradman, who just died recently. And but apart from that, and see the two heroes in Australia were the Anzacs and our cricketers. I mean, if there were two groups you want to think of. And again, this sort of, that we're victims of imperialism and that we were only duped into fighting in World War One. I mean, and all this stuff in Republicans come out recently. Well, of course, we fought in World War One because we were, in effect, British. I mean, again, those days it was about a 96% British community. And the identification was very firm. I mean, when I was a boy at school, there was a chart on the wall, the growth of an empire based on political freedom. First date, 1215, Magna Carta. And by the time I got to high school, I knew, the structure. And so great things that Australia got from England are, first of all, the English language, of which there's a strong Australian variant, as you know, but it's English. The second thing is the Westminster system of government, which is by far the best in the world. I mean, the Westminster system, whatever you say about it. The third thing is the common law, and so it was automatically assumed in a British colony that you carried the English law with you. The next thing was free speech, free press, right from the beginning. If you read the colonial press in the 1830s, there's some good, hard-hitting stuff in it. English education, grammar school tradition. I mean, I grew up went to school in a small grammar school. In effect, would have been called grammar school here. It was in which I learned Latin, French, English, history, mathematics.
Is it still
chemistry.
Possible?
Yes.
To be taught that in Australia?
Not as well, you might get Indonesian now instead of Latin, which no bad thing. But I mean, I used to think when I was learning irregular French verbs, how horrible they are, that it was a bit irrelevant, always leading Caesar's Gallic Wars. I thought, what the bloody hell am I reading this for? And temperature outside's 100 and so forth. But that was no worse than reading English poetry about how kind nature is. Well, everyone knows in Australia nature's out to get you. It's a hostile element, you've got to look after it and control it and be careful. But we looked on this, we called England the home country. And there was no dissonance in this. I mean, the only dissonance was that it was as though we were a colony, attached to Cornwall, drifted along and finished up in the South Seas. The identification was more or less complete, and so it damn well should have been, and still is to a large extent.
Did you know Sir Keith Hancock?
Very well. Very well.
Not when he was professor here in Oxford, but when he went back to
just
Australia.
Knew him a little bit then, but I knew him well, and of course then I knew him at the ANU. No, I knew him very well. He was professor when I was here, yes.
But he wasn't really an economic historian.
Well, who is an economic historian? Are you an economic historian?
Yes.
Am I?
Yeah, certainly.
Certainly. Well, I'm not certain about that.
No, but I'm other things too, and I doubt that you are too.
But I think that, he edited the war series, and that big book of his on British war economy is very good. The thing about Hancock, of course, he was very, very, very able. That was, and he had a marvellous capacity for commanding a great body of work and bringing it to, and he wrote very well. Don't forget, he did that, when he said non-negotiable, he did that Chatham House, that survey of the British Empire in the 1930s, in which there's a very good appendix chapter by Court on imperialism, which is interesting. He did the British war histories, economic histories. So I don't think his inclination was particularly towards economics as a tool in history, but he was general concept of what an economy is and how to explain it was history. And of course he wrote one of the best books in Australia. It reminds me, he wrote a little history of Australia when he was Professor of History in Adelaide, which reminds me in its style and its influence with Ashton's Industrial Revolution. Really? Beautifully written book and very, very good. Yeah. A fairly liberal.
One of Charles Wilson's later works, very oddly to my mind,
Of
was
Australia.
a history of Australia.
Yes,
How did you put him up to that?
No, I didn't put him up to it, but the publishers asked me should they publish it. And I said yes. Anything Charles writes is worth having a go at. Residio it was a bit odd in a way, but it's extremely interesting, and especially if you know Charles. No, it wasn't.
There was some woman, I think.
There's always a woman. No. He had a wife, and then he had another wife, and then he had another wife. Maybe I've forgotten now, but anyway, it doesn't matter. But he went to Australia, yes, to see her, for a woman. He died there, actually.
Yes.
And no, Charles was great fun.
I agree.
I used to go over to Cambridge regularly and do the George and I used to stay in Jesus with Charles. And, very pleasant evenings indeed.
A more powerful influence on English, British economic history, certainly from the 60s onwards, I suppose it flows on from this period dominated, as you rightly say, by a concern with economic growth. But by the late 60s, there was something that a number of Americans, sometimes perhaps rather aggressively, called the new economic history.
Oh, yes.
Now, you're obviously in favour of economic theory, and you're in favour of counting. You earlier said you were in favour of arithmetic.
Right.
They, of course, went a bit further, and therefore, would I be right in supposing that you would have had a rather complex response to the rise of the new economic history?
Well, first of all, I knew all of them, and they're a bloody marvellous lot. I mean, they really are a remarkable group of people. Very good economic historians, and of course, very good economists. And what they did was carry the use of the statistical inference and econometrics much further than, well, a few people in this country did, but much further than in this country. And they did some very good work. I mean, Vogel is a very good example. I mean, there's no doubt about his work on rail relations, it's very important. But yes, no, I didn't, and I always called myself, wasn't a fellow traveller. I sympathised with them. I didn't want to, and indeed, I mean, I was the person who encouraged,
Hawke.
No. Well, he knew it. He was a good economist from North London again.
Flood.
Flood. I encouraged Broderick and indeed the college financed his trip to America to learn some, some of the techniques of the econometricians and so on and apply to history. And then he wrote that little book on. No, I admire them, but I don't see that. I ask one question about them. Let's stick to England, which is what I know, or Britain, I should say. Has econometrics or economic history or new economic history radically changed our view of anything in British economic history?
Well, the answer to me is not obviously radically anyway,
no.
But it has possibly, in the view of some, it has had, possibly as a byproduct, a very unfortunate effect, because it has made the subject very unpopular with students, yes. Particularly with students of history. Yes. Students of economics pay no attention to it, and they happen to fill the gap. And students of history increasingly find that economic history is arid and theoretical and boring and full of every sort of figure except the human.
Well, I don't think it's, I mean, I think they just don't understand it and they haven't got the technical tools, and that's unfortunate, but I agree with you. I mean, I think that, see, I've always said to myself, I will never write anything which any reasonably well educated person can't read and understand. I never have. But I never tried to use, I mean, for example, my doctoral thesis had a lot of mathematics in it, simple addition and subtraction. I didn't even do any correlations, things like this. And I did 2 years university mathematics, so I was capable of doing some of this stuff, but I wasn't the slightest bit interested. And I think that, I think it was a misfortune in this country to get departments of economic history.
Ah, tell me why.
Well, I thought the old system whereby you had economic historians in the history department, you had economic historians, or at least should have had economic historians in the economics department, and you had students so that the ones in the economics department might towards the new economic history, the ones in the history department say, well, like you or me, maybe I could have gone the other one, but So the students had a real choice, and the techniques and problems were different. I mean, look at the great controversy about whether the Industrial Revolution, whether the growth of output of the Industrial Revolution was X% or 9. Well, I don't think you'll ever have the statistics will settle that anyway. But it doesn't damn well matter. I mean, we know what we have in the way of statistics is structural change, which is the outstanding feature of the Industrial Revolution, economically. And of course we know that in the short and the long run there was economic growth. And I don't think it matters whether the growth was 3% or 2% or 5% or it happened. And so that, but no, I think that the new economic history have sharpened the tools of economics. It's made people more careful about specifying problems, which is very important because, you know, there's a lot of loose talk about what you're doing. And it has also enhanced the use of good statistical analysis in the solution of certain problems in economic history. And that's to an advantage. I mean, it's now the fact that, I mean, I would say that they should still be able to write it in language that people can understand or explain it. But the real trouble about why students don't like it, they don't understand it. They haven't got the technical tools to do it. You have to be trained as an econometrician and so on to be able to do it, and as a statistician.
So this is a balanced view, in other words, of the new economic history. But you still have to, however balanced a view you take of that, you still have to explain the decline of popularity. You see, this decline in the membership of the society since the mid-70s is echoed in any other statistical indicator you look at. People offering themselves for A-level in economic history, people wanting to take degrees in economic history, people taking... I teach the Industrial Revolution at UCL, and I joined Robin Craig in teaching it when I went to UCL in '69. All through the 70s and 80s, we had 60 or 70 students a year doing it. It was keenly studied. We were teaching the sort of thing that you do perfectly well. In the 90s, the number of such people fell off, and this year, for example, I'm teaching 2 students the Industrial Revolution. It's true, I got a little piece of paper the other day saying that 5 people have put their name down for next year. Now, I'm a little bit protected because I'm in a history department, but of course the economic history departments, all set up in the great boom of the 60s and 70s, have of course, virtually all. You were protected at Oxford too, because of course you didn't have a separate department, and Cambridge. And okay, I'm in a history department.
That's what I say, it's better.
Oh, I can follow that. But how are you what sort of explanation? Maxine Berg claims that it's a matter of marketing, and she used to have a course at Warwick called, what was it called, Giorgio? Something like The Rise of Industrial Society, and she found less and less people doing it, so she changed its name. Do you know what she changed it to? She changed it to Georgian England, and she said now they're flocking in.
Well, I think she attributes too much to that, but still, I think that this period here was a very exciting period in economic history.
The growth period, yes?
Yes. I mean, economic history was intrinsically more interesting because there was excitement in the 20s and 30s. But in this period, well, first of all, you've got 2 things. I mean, it goes, universities grew, many more universities. Well, that should mean more economic historians. But I don't think there was ever any justification having departments of economic history. I think that was a great failure, a great mistake, because the subject is, well, first of all, it is basically history. It's history. It's not economics. But economics, I think, you know, I have a lot of sympathy with the old historical school that you don't have theoretical economics from induction, or not very often. But if economists are going to look at the subject as in any terms of reality, of course they should know economic history and see where economics can explain things. But I've always said to students, historians who came to me want to know what I should learn from economics. I said, well, you should learn 3 things. I said, if supply goes up, price goes down. If demand goes up, price goes up. And you might make it a bit more complicated about elasticities. And I said that the other thing, there are no exogenous factors. And I said, keep those in 3, and then ask this question: Who wants this? Who's sort of responsible for this event, or this? How much did it cost, and who paid? When you put those questions in a row, you don't know much more. That gets them going on the subject anyway. And of course, that's economic histories in Oxford and Cambridge has been protected certainly by the system. And of course, although it's always been an option, I mean, in PPE here, it's always been an option, but there's always a respectable number do it. I mean, I used to go along lecturing in the university hall, in university schools, and I used to get about 30 students, and that was about as many as did the paper, and that was enough. I mean, that's a good class.
In this period of apparent decline, using these statistical indicators, of course it has achieved, this is the thesis I'm going to advance in Glasgow anyway, it has achieved, of course, an enormous intellectual success because it entirely swept history. The sort of old-fashioned history that was very narrowly political, perhaps ecclesiastical, perhaps diplomatic, that flourished in Oxford, certainly in 1926 when the society was founded, flourished everywhere. And putting economic and social things back into history has achieved an enormous success because now with historians you can't really tell if they're political historians or economic historians or social historians or cultural historians.
Good.
And so this is an intellectual victory that has left the subject institutionally in an odd position.
Institutionally, not institutionally racist. Look, I'm not certain. You know, if you go back and read the great historians of the 19th century, you'll start from Macaulay and keep on going, and J.R. Green, and finish up with Maitland. They were well aware of economic history.
Yes.
If you look, for example, go back to the 1890s, foundation of the Royal Economic Society with the Journal, the Economic Journal. Half the council, if I remember rightly, in the first council were economic historians. If you look at the articles in that, there were economic history articles all the time. Look at the reviews, and not only did they review economic history, they reviewed it from France, from Germany, and around the... It was a very much more eclectic subject.
But very, very different 100 years later.
Very different from, yes, I mean, by the 1930s and 40s, I think that I think economists more or less got to the stage, we don't want economics a waste of time, but then economic historians started to think about economic history departments and so forth, and well, but again, see, after the war, that growth period, and I don't think economic history has been as interesting after the great debates. There's nothing like a great debate and the difference, and lively writing and so forth. I mean, whatever else one might say about the Hartwell-Hobsbawm controversy, it's internationally famous, and it commands interest. I mean, you can't. I mean, it's
endless examination questions.
That's right. It's good fun. It's good
Still
fun,
there.
and it was deadly serious too. I mean, of course, Marxists write history to make history, and therefore, so they're never wrong. They can't be wrong. But see, a lot of other things came in which were interesting. I mean, what is now called gender studies, Christ. Practically everything about women and the Industrial Revolution was written by Ivy Peacock back in the 1920s and 30s. Pinchbeck, yes. Great book. Great book.
There's been quite a lot of interesting work now on gender history, you have to admit, Max, in recent times.
Well, I'm too anti-female. You know, I only had a wife and 4 daughters, so I was pro-feminist from the beginning.
I'm going to ask Giorgio if he wants to ask you anything in a minute, but there's one more thing I want to raise with you, because a few weeks ago I had dinner with Simon Jenkins, the former editor of the Times.
Yes.
And he tells me that the only teacher that he had at Oxford who influenced his thought in any way was you.
Oh, really?
And he said he was absolutely gripped by going to your lectures on economic history, and he decided that he wanted to be a research student and come to Nuffield and work on the rate of interest. And I said, why didn't you? He said, I wasn't good enough. So he didn't become the economic historian which he wanted to do. He had to sink into being editor of the Evening Standard and then of the Times. But do you remember him from that time?
No, I don't remember him at all. See, one of the
He said he only had one personal conversation with you because he wanted you to be his supervisor, but he went to your lectures and they influenced him powerfully.
oh, good.
And of course we think of the subject as booming and producing academics, but of course obviously there were most of the students who came in the boom period didn't of course become academic economic historians.
Well, you can get if you look at my book on the Industrial Revolution Economic Growth, that's all lectures. See, practically everything I published came from a lecture. I've written, I did my MA thesis on the economic history of England, and incidentally was quite different than the economic history from Australia before that. I mean, I did it from the economy. But I don't suppose you'd call me a great researcher. There's a history of the Montpellier Society there, which wouldn't interest most economic historians, although perhaps should. And I've written a whole lot of articles and so forth, but I've always considered myself a teacher rather than anything else. I like teaching. I got on extremely well with students, and a lot of them became very close friends, like Patrick O'Brien. And I was happy in Oxford, so I suppose I lacked the incentive to write a lot of books. Anyway, if you can write one article, it gets as much publicity. That's the standard of living. Why worry about any others?
Absolutely.
I never expected that, you know. I mean, it was like getting on a non-stop train. I just really was quite surprised at the reaction to that. But of course the Marxists hadn't been challenged at all. Ashton was too much of a gentleman. His articles are on the standard of living are absolutely, strongly in favour of, as you know, but Hobbes and people just ignored him completely. It's so when I took it on, I mean, when I first came to Oxford and that article of Eric's on the standard of living in 1957, I think it was, I thought, God, you can't get away with this. I mean, for example, just take lots of things in it, which anyway, he's going to be there, I believe. So you better not put me in on that one.
Oh yes, why not?
Why not indeed? But anyway, and I had been, I'd been actually. The first article I wrote was given as a paper in Sydney. In Sydney, with a couple of other people, we formed what was called the Sydney Historians Group, just informal group, which we used to meet once every month, I think, and someone would give a paper. Well, the opening paper I gave the opening paper, which is in effect that article of mine which I published in the Journal of Economic History called Interpretation of the Industrial Revolution.
Oh yes.
And what was interesting, I mean, one of the most interesting things was a Whig law historian, who was shocked when he saw, all Whig stuff. He was shocked because he'd read the Hammonds when he was a student, and he just could not believe that they weren't correct. And everything they said. So, but it's
the thing that is true of all Marxist historians, all historians of the left, one of the things that characterises them, of course, is that they can't count because they're not interested in counting, with the exception only of Eric Hobsbawm.
Well, he counts and counts. I mean, for example, in one of his articles, he's got unemployment figures. I noticed the years he gets all from the trough years of the cycle.
Oh yes.
That's all right.
Plus you give UK figures to include Ireland.
Well, he should have said these are the worst figures I could find, or something like this. Which he said to me. He said, I tried to find the worst figures I could. Well, that's honest to me, but I mean, this misleads the reader. I don't think Eric can count either myself, but give him my regards, will you?
I will.
But see, I'm not. I never occupied a very prominent role in the subject or in the society. I mean, I was editor of the review, which is the most important thing to do, but I didn't. I was never in office in any of the society's things. I mean, I never tried to be. I think that in a way, I mean, living in Oxford has been probably too comfortable to me. I mean, pleasant way of life, good colleagues, excellent students, good libraries. I could keep myself endlessly occupied and interested. And of course, I didn't. I have been offered various jobs around the country, but I never really took them seriously. When I wrote something, it was very often reaction, like that one on the standard of living. And as I say, nearly all the industrial revolution economic growth was just lectures which I gave, and I've enlarged a little bit and put down, but it was, I should have done more, of course I should have done more, but then, you know, you can't do everything. See, the Oxford system works well because the academics do three things. They teach and research, but they also administer. And until recently, the whole of the administration of Oxford was fundamentally and basically under the control of the academics. It's changing. I mean, they've made a permanent vice-chancellorship now, which is bad, I think. And you felt an obligation to do. Now, I'd worked in libraries, and I was librarian in my college, and I was on the libraries board and so forth. But it means, of course, that, you know, you're pretty well occupied by the time you teach. And I taught a lot, see, for example. I taught more than perhaps I should have. I was statutorily obliged to teach only, 26 lectures a year, something like that. That's all the duties specified in the statutes of appointment.
26?
I think it's my 36, it might be 36.
36. They're odd numbers. Oh well, then 36 is divisible by 3.
Yes. Well, it might be 24. 3 8s are 24. 8-week terms. It might be 24. But of course, I supervised usually 6 to 8 undergraduates every term. I always had 6 to 8 graduate students. I not only lectured regularly, but once or twice a week, or took a lecture in a class each week. And I was fully occupied.
Sure.
And I liked it.
And you liked it?
I liked it. And the satisfaction, I mean, for example, you take overseas students now, practically anywhere I go, there'll be a grateful student waiting for me to look after me all the time. Now, the thing about good students is they always attribute you with more influence than you deserve. Success they tend to attribute to you know, the people who were civilised. Well, of course, that's plenty, but I mean, I remember once a chap got a job and he wrote back and he said, you know, I must thank you for working so hard to get me this job. I said, look, I didn't work hard at all. I said, you worked hard, you did well. I said, all I did was write an honest account of your work to the selection committee. I said, good, you know, students do it themselves mainly. The better they are, the more they do it themselves, and the best ones tend to attribute more, blame's not the word, more credit to you than you deserve, which is nice, I mean, very nice. But see, you take some of my teachers, students, Vera Zamani, who's been very successful. Klaus Hennings, well, of course, he died, unfortunately. Leandro, in Spain.
The man you mentioned in Argentina.
Yeah, by Ezekiel Gallio, yes, was very good. And some in America, well, I mean, Nick von Tunzelman here, and Gary Hawke in New Zealand, several in Australia. But it's, and that relationship is, well, I suppose it's sort of paternal in a way.
Yeah.
And it's, I mean, I haven't learned as much from students as they learned from me. I mean, the thing about, I'd say about really good students is they might be brighter than me, almost certainly in many cases, but I knew much more than they did. That's, see, you accumulate knowledge, and of course you also accumulate sort of low cunning. I mean, you know, I remember I used to have a very unpleasant student who used to, he was an American actually, not, that doesn't, it's not a racist remark, he just happened to be an American. And he gave a very bad essay to me and he started expostulating. I said, okay, let's read it. And I read that aloud to him. I said, I'll be the student, you be the supervisor. And of course, you can read an article in such a way it sounds bloody awful anyway. But I read it out, but halfway through he said, I've had enough. He was not having enough. No, it's the tutorial system, of course, you're very lucky in Oxford. The tutorial system is a marvellous system. Yeah. Because you get to know the students extremely well. And you really do, it is really a confrontation. It's the old Socratic dialogue. I mean, they read an essay and you pick them up and you bandy words and so forth. I mean, and they're very much, I mean, and you can help them, and well, especially undergraduates, you help. Undergraduates, particularly good because they, you know, they're unopinionated. Well, they might be opinionated, but they know they've got to learn something, and they're very lively and interchange and so forth. No, I always like teaching undergraduates.
Very good. Those are all very important points. Georgia, is there anything you'd like to ask?
Yeah, two questions, and they are related to students and to a word you didn't like, institutional. And Negley said that economic history has a very bad institutional position. I mean, there will be a few, actually, probably 20 PhD students in Glasgow. And I can tell you that there are very few jobs in economic history
Of course,
at the moment.
that's right. But then the same
Probably
thing.
one a year. I mean, very few. What would you say to, young researcher interested in economic history but with few possibilities?
Well, what I say to any young student, I said, what do you want to do? Do it. And I said, there may not be any jobs, but if you do a good job, there'll be jobs. I mean, not necessarily in that subject, but in something else. So I'm a great believer that students, by the time they reach university, should have some idea what they'd like to do. And I think that the motivation is much stronger if you let them do their own. For example, I always had a list of subjects which the only two I never was successful with was I wanted a student to write on water. I mean, one of the great subjects of the 19th century now, I mean, there's a bit done on it, but towns had to have water, etc., etc. And it all brought up the problem of who owns it and how do you distribute it. The other thing is, if you like, sex. I mean, all these wonderful reports they sent you on prostitution in the garrison towns and so forth. But they were too scared to take that on. They thought, somehow that's, what will people think of me? And I say they might think well of you actually. I mean, it'll be interesting for a start. But no, I never got a student ever to work on.
Wasn't Tom Lacour?
Tom's done a bit of that. Now he's one of my best students.
He was. But did you have? He did Sunday schools, didn't he, with you?
He did.
He discovered sex after you.
Yes, yes. His was a very good thesis. I don't know whether you've read the preface in it. And he says that those who know Dr Hartwell will realise or will be able to see his insidious influence on every page of his thesis.
Insidious?
Insidious influence. He was a student radical from Princeton. And Lawrence Stone's a great friend of mine. Lawrence used to send me good students. Rick Traynor was another one. Rick is a first-rate chap and everybody. Of course, he's turned out to be a first-rate administrator. But anyway, he was as cocky as they come when he arrived. And not Rick, I mean
Tom.
And anyway, I remember after he'd been here a little while, he said, I don't know, he said, I thought it was going to be tough around here. I said, he said, no one's, he said, English history, he said, economic history, he said, better off than Princeton. He said, no one will give me some criticism. So I used to run a private seminar in my room and, with the students. I got them together and I said, now, I've asked Tom to give a paper. I want you all to give him hell. I said, pick him up at every damn thing, his grammar, anything you like. And he came in, and I gave him hell, and everyone else gave him hell. And after it was all over, we'd have tea, or a bit later we'd have a sherry or something. Tom disappeared for a little while. Came back and said, what do you mean, Tom? He said, I went away to dry my tears. He took it very well, of course. But he never complained of lack of criticism after that. No, he was an excellent student. And David Phillips was another, two students of mine. A chap who works on crime who's now in Australia. Well, he's gone into law, he's become a professional lawyer. But he's, sorry,
Did you say there were two questions?
Yes.
So that is, do your own thing, is what he says
Yes,
further.
there's a second question that is related again to my students. I'm a teaching assistant. I have a degree in economics from an Italian university.
Yes.
I'm interested in economic history, but of course I'm a teaching assistant of 18th century British history. And my students are not keen at all in everything that is economic. But of course the debate, the standard of living debate is coming with social history. And they say both you and Professor Osborne were wrong, but also right, both of you. And what they cannot understand in the set is to have any ideology or political aspect associated to what they considered a kind of academic debate. They cannot accept the idea of politics or political ideas associated to history is
This is
disappearing
post-Cold War.
from students.
Yes, well, I mean, I, of course, as you probably know, said that, well, one of the most interesting questions in history is why, on the basis of the same evidence, a historian comes to different points of view. And I say largely ideology. I mean, there are various explanations, maybe, you know, poor historian will get it wrong, but it's usually ideology. And I think that you have to try as a good historian to make, if you have it yourself. Well, the way you can do it, of course, is by making sure that if you have any prejudices, you wear them very, very openly. Now, I mean, people have accused me of being just a, you know, a dyed-in-the-wool old conservative who's just trying to justify my point of view. Well, I've never been a conservative. I'm a, if you like, a John Stuart Mill radical. I mean, there are two, for example, two pieces on the role of government in society, which I always make students read. It's Adam Smith, Book 5, and John Stuart Mill, Principle of Political Economy, Book 5, on the role of government. Both of them superb. And, you know, I mean, I've been influenced around every individual. John said that there should be a circle from which everyone is authoritatively excluded. Of course, he allowed for a great deal of government influence and so on. But I think that the idea of objectivity, of course, is one which, well, it's a ticklish one. But I think when it becomes too obvious that your ideology is really determining what you write, then you should be very suspicious.
Do you think you should be also very suspicious? With the new economic history, it seems to me that they're always telling us that the difference depends on the figures you have, and how, you know, if you have good figures, you will achieve different results.
Yes, well, I remember
No ideology there.
one new economic historian said to me, if you can't count it, it doesn't matter. And I said, what about love and hate? He said, well, they don't matter really. I said, they bloody will do, mate. But still. I don't know whether I have an adequate answer. I mean, both those are big questions. We should have some seminars on them. But I must tell you, still, is that a satisfactory answer? No?
Yes, thank you.
Right. I must tell you one thing about me before you go, Negley. Some years ago, an ex-student of mine suggested to a professor somewhere in the north that I should be the visiting lecturer for the term, or interview lecturer. This professor said, good God, no, not that loud-mouthed Australian bore. And the student had told me, I burst out laughing. He said, what are you laughing at? I said, it's not a bad description, is it? He said, that's... But anyway, loud-mouthed Australian bore. So the family love it. That's what... it's, obviously, I think that there was a certain prejudice against me by being colonial, coming in, going to one of the best sort of jobs in the country, editing the review, and being very firm in say, my interpretation of various parts of history. Now that is annoying. I can see that, and I can understand why he called me a loud-mouthed Australian bore.
It's a most inappropriate characterisation. But of course, a thing about you that can annoy some of the most boring people in the subject, of course, is that you evidently enjoy yourself.
I enjoy it enormously. Yes.
I think that can engender some jealousy.
Yes, I suppose. I don't see why it should be, but still.
Max, is there any... we covered, I think, everything that I thought of raising. Do you think there's anything you'd like to say that I haven't in some way... that hasn't in some way been actually said or implied?
I think you've got enough, because you're not going to do I mean, when you put this together, the whole thing's going to take an hour, isn't it? So you've got
well, we've got into our session, but we're only going to use, if I may say, snippets of you, and the people are not there. But we will keep this. This will be, I think the right word is laid down. This tape will be laid down because it might be interesting to someone at the time of the centenary. Because look how interesting we would have thought it was to have a film of the opening meeting with Eileen Power and Tawney saying this is what we should do.
That's right.
So we will keep the whole thing for posterity,
That's fine.
and we will use one or two snippets.
Well,
from
you have
Glasgow.
complete freedom to use anything you like out of that.
Enormously grateful to you.
I'm not. Anyone doesn't like it, hard bloody luck is what I say.
Thank you.